started, I just, again, we'll do the same format as yesterday. If anybody has questions, just ask as we go along, and we'll sort of toss it back and forth. So, same learning objectives that we have, looking at risks and how we can reduce them, and then the record keeping that goes along with them. We do have, really great soil to work with, but the thing is, we do need to take care of it, and when we can use organic soil amendments and that really does help, maintain our soil and keep it good for the uses that we need to do it. So, that's why we use manures and some of the compost base and compost teas, but we just have to be cognizant of, obviously we're using those things, that there are risks with that, as with everything that we've looked at since yesterday. So for the purposes of this discussion today, these are sort of the terminology, this is the terminology that we're going to use. So manure, again, for the discussions today, is going to be raw or untreated material. And we'll talk a little bit more about what treatment means. Compost is going to be treated or processed manure, not necessarily, organic waste or culls, but more the manure base. So again, it's that fecal type byproduct. So because that's where more of the risk is, because you're going to have that potential for pathogens. And then the compost tea is going to be the steeped or the brewed composted material. So the number 2, it's a steep or brewed of that material. So again, it's that manure or that fecal matter byproduct that we're using for the teas. Now, compost teas can have a lot of different stuff in it. We'll talk about that. But just kind of keep those things in mind as we go through, because maybe when we say compost, you might think sort of more of the brines and the organic waste and the culls versus treated manure. So, why do we use manures? Well, in compost teas, we're using those to help with, improve the nutrients, give the soil, give our crop what it needs, what it might be deficient in, and maybe provide some, bringing it maybe back to where it needs to be as far as a healthy soil or a healthy starting material. It also does help promote that biological diversity in the soil, bringing in bacteria, promoting fungi, because we need all those things to keep things healthy. Like we talked about yesterday, even in our own bodies, we have, bacteria that stay, resident bacteria that we need that to keep us healthy, and it's no different for the soil in our environment. We use it often to help enhance, our crop fertility, the soil fertility, and use it for different purposes. Excuse me. And then if we can look at using some of those alternatives, or using maybe what we might already have at the farm, say manures if we have livestock, or other sort of waste and culls that we can utilize some of that leftover nutrients, then we might reduce that need of looking elsewhere, bringing in, say, those fertilizers, or from off farm when we can make use of those maybe potential farm waste that we already have. As we go through this presentation today, you'll see this symbol a lot. And like I said, there's a lot of things, because it is manure, that it's covered under the Nutrient Management Act. So, and that act is manure management falls under the Ontario Regulation 26703. So wherever you see this, there's some sort of regulation or legislation that's applicable to that item that we've identified. So just keep that in mind, because you will see it a lot throughout this, and there's just so much, and there's a lot of variables when it comes to using manure, storing manure, applying manure, the type of manure, all those things, and especially too if your farm or operation falls under where it needs, like where it's required to have a nutrient management plan, there's additional requirements that need to be followed, and those are addressed in that plan. So again, we're trying to just look at the food safety aspect, but it's kind of hard to do that without getting it a little bit technical. So we'll try and keep it pretty light-hearted, but just be aware of what that means when we go through this. We talked about the different types of bacteria and parasites, and because this particular talk is on fecal matter, manure, these are the ones that you're going to be most concerned with, and that will be the focus when we're talking about manures and soil amendments. So again, no different than what we talked about yesterday. Pathogens are everywhere. They're not always from fecal matter, but they are everywhere and they can harm us. And we did identify yesterday that that given the proper environment, pathogens can survive for a very long time. And if we think about what's in manure or compost teas, there's a lot of nutrients, a lot of moisture, a really fantastic environment actually for pathogens to survive. So that's why there's a higher risk with this type of product, because it's just a great environment for pathogens to survive versus if it was just something else where it might not have a lot of that sort of the life standards to survive for a very long time. Whether or not a pathogen survives does depend on the moisture content and those environmental elements. If it's being exposed to a lot of sunlight, a lot of drying, then obviously it's not going to live as well as if it had like a moist and some of that protective measures with its surrounding environment. So manure does naturally contain bacteria and virus in that. As identified yesterday, not all of them are bad, but some of them are pathogens, and that's what we're concerned with. But when we talk about manure and why there's such a focus on it, the real risk with it is when it's going to start to contaminate our surrounding areas or our waterways and our surface areas. And when we talk about the nutrient management plan, that is the focus, like runoff and leaching. So runoff is where you have sort of like this, anything on the surface, from waters, excessive waters, even if it's a spray event, irrigation event, taking whatever hasn't been sort of worked into the soil, and that's taking any of that organic matter into the water surface. Leachate is where we go more into the soil and affect our groundwater. So those are the two biggest things that we're concerned about when we're talking about manure. There are some other things, just even cross-contamination, but it's the water and the contamination of the surrounding environment. So when we talk about runoff and leaching, our areas of risk and their focus areas are these sensitive areas, and also the areas that can further impact what we're doing with our product, because we're using surface water or wells, different things that we need to irrigate our crop or use that water for other things, or we might even be nearby to a water course. These are all things that we need to be very cognizant of when we're looking at using manures or other soil amendments. So runoff, like I mentioned, is that liquid that's coming in direct contact with that manure, and then as it passes by or carries through, it's taking any of that, some of that organic material. With that organic material can be some of that pathogenic content as well. When you have that runoff, there's soil manure and liquid manure, but that runoff can contain pretty much the same. It can be just like liquid manure depending on what it's contacted. So again, this is just to keep those things in mind as we go through this presentation. And then the leachate is, when you have that rain event and then it goes down through the soil and affects the groundwater. So as I mentioned, when we talk about compost for today, that's the treated or processed manure. So we're not talking about the organic byproducts, but we're just talking about manure. So this is where that manure is going to go through a process, a treatment process, so that any of those pathogens that might be present in that manure get reduced to an acceptable or safe level. Compost teas, we talked about that steep or brood material. There are risks with these teas because there is a lot of nutrients and a lot of additives, and if that base material that you're starting with isn't what we call mature or hasn't been treated properly, then you have that risk of incorporating additional pathogens into this product. And then as you're adding all these additives and additional nutrients to make that compost tea work, you're really just feeding those pathogens if they're there, and then it can make your product very risky. There's still a lot of work to be done scientifically about compost teas and how to use them properly and how to make them properly, because in a lot of instances, they'll say, well, this works for this application, so I'm just going to throw it in that tea. And again, it kind of works with anything. Just because it works for one thing doesn't mean it's going to work with other. There's not a lot of science behind this right now, so there's still a lot of uncertainties as far as the risk that's associated with compost teas. The other thing with compost tea is that you are using specific tools, kettles, boiling pots, and if you make one tea and then you go and use it, and then if you haven't cleaned or sanitized that tool or that kettle, then now the same thing with anything, whatever's left over, if there was a risk there before, now you're just going to be contaminating your new compost tea or your new lot. There's also different tea types. There are ones that are strictly manure teas, and that is basically brewing manure, like raw fecal matter, so I'm sure you can understand what the risk would be there. And then teas, just like manure or compost, should not be applied directly to the crops. So with that edible portion, but of course there's a direct risk there, so it needs to be applied to the soil and then incorporated very quickly. You'll see that through the presentation today. So there's a lot of risks when we use soil amendments. Most of them would fall into the environmental type, so air contamination and surface water. I mean, surface water is a main concern for us, but it's almost a secondary factor, because what we're concerned about is the risk of human health. And again, that relates back to what it contains and how it can contaminate other things that we use to grow our product. And environmentally, you can see in certain cases, if there's too much of the nutrients being run off into our surface water, then that can create algae blooms, which then can suffocate the fish and kill wildlife and whatnot. So those are secondary features. We're looking at human health, but again, these are things to just keep in mind as we go through.
What's the recommended distance from your compost manure pile to open water?
For open water, we have a slide on it. I believe it's 50 meters. A general sort of, how do I say it, like regular buffer area is a minimum of 3 meters, but when you get some of those sensitive areas, it increases a lot. And that does depend too whether it's a permanent sort of storage site for your manure compost, or if it's a temporary one, if you might have mounds in the fields or whatnot, and we discussed that a little bit. And you will have that reference slide in your book. So our surrounding area, runoff or leaching, the focus, just like we talked about before, because the pathogens and other things can adhere to like the fruit, the leaves, and the surrounding environment very easily, there's a big risk in that respect. So it can be through direct contact, but the other thing that you might not always think about is even through splash up. So, if that manure hasn't been incorporated, or that soil amendment hasn't been incorporated into the soil very quickly, and now it's just laying there on the surface, and you have a large raining event that we're supposed to be getting today, that process of splashing up, then that can also contaminate your product. It's very similar if you think of that pressure washer, when we talked about that yesterday, when all the aerosols are flying the dirt all over your property or all over your premises, it can contaminate your walls, your floors. Same sort of thing with a rain event. If that's there, it's going to splash up and contaminate your product. The other way is by that cross-contamination. Again, whether it be clothing, boots, tires, equipment, it's that same process. So if you're using a tractor, say, to spread manure in the manure or in the livestock field, or to spread it, in your field, whether it's post-harvest or whatnot, but then you're going to go to another field with that same tractor, you really want to make sure that you're cognizant of where you're going and where you've been. So if you are using that same piece of equipment, then you want to make sure that you're trying to clean it off as much as possible, so that you're not introducing additional risks. And I know probably what's going on in your mind right now as well is dirt. My products grow in dirt every day. Like, what's the issue? Touches, whether it be tomatoes or something else. The difference is if it's raw manure, you have that risk. When we apply raw manure to our soil, we have to wait at a minimum 120 days before we can harvest that product. So there is, and that's kind of like a treatment process, right? Because that gives enough time for some of those pathogens to die off. But if you have that direct contact with the raw manure, there hasn't been that treatment process, so there's just that higher risk, and that's why it is a little bit different when we talk about the crops growing right around at that particular point versus post-harvest to that days to harvest interval. This particular case study that I'm going to talk about is maybe a little bit different than the ones we've talked about in the past, because I just wanted to throw something different in there. We've talked about those direct food-related recalls because of a food safety incident. This particular one goes back to our little friends, the fish, and this was because of surface water contamination. Again, it was because of runoff, and there was a dairy field nearby, so it was that runoff from the livestock, and there was applied manure to the field, so it was very fresh and it didn't get incorporated very quickly. So when it rained, the runoff went right into the water source. So there was heavy rains. There was also, like I said, there's a lot of technical things when it comes to manure and soil management. There's slopes involved, and in this particular case, it was an improper field slope, like you shouldn't have more than 3%. It was a much higher grade, so the runoff was, it didn't really have much time to actually get into, like be absorbed, so the water took it away. There wasn't a lot of separation distance from those sensitive areas, and then it wasn't incorporated quickly. So in this particular case, I know we always focus on human health, but I like to bring this one up just because it is a fact and it's something that we need to consider. That surface water was so severely contaminated that there was a mass death of wildlife or fish. In this particular incident, over 2,000 fish were killed. And then, you know, as we think about, okay, well, depending on what that water source was, what do we, you know, are we using that water for something else, like irrigating our crop? And if we are, if it's killing fish, then what can it potentially do to our crops? So I just, like I said, I just want to put that one in for that reason, just to kind of sort of play two sides of the fence on that one. Yes.
Did they say, like, what caused the fish die-off? Because with fish dying off and that kind of number, that wouldn't be from pathogenic material, that would be from either nutrient load or just clouding of the water.
Yeah, they didn't really specify, like they do, in a lot of cases, it's usually caused from an algae bloom, but they did say it was a lot of the from the toxicity in the path, like from that runoff in the water that caused it. They didn't show an algae bloom in any of the pictures to indicate that that might be what it was from the suffocation, but they just said whatever was in the water, they linked it to the runoff, that was the direct linkage to that fish die-off. So when we talk, you can see here's our sign here. So when we're talking about, you know, applying manures and soil amendments, it does follow the Nutrient Management Act. And it applies to all of these things. So whether we're storing it, just trying to manage it on our farm, if we're keeping it for any length of time, or if we have a multi-commodity operation, you know, what equipment we're using, how we're applying it, when we're applying it, and then just general use of it. So just keep that in mind if, you know, that there are regulations that apply to it. So when we talk about storage sites, there's two different types. There's a permanent storage site, so that's where you're actually going to have a structured building with walls and a roof, probably berms or curbs, so if there are, water does get into that facility, that it's going to divert it away from any sensitive areas. And then there's also the temporary field sites, and those are the ones that are going to be those where you get maybe manure delivered to your premise, and it's a mound that sits in a field or close by the field where you're going to be using it. But regardless of what it is, like what type of storage that you're using, the storage location is very, very important. Again, because of those sensitive areas or surrounding areas, they need to be identified and designated, especially if it's going to be a permanent structure. And those permanent structures need to be, you know, usually looked at by an engineer to make sure that it is accommodating all those requirements for storages. You need to have that separated distance from sensitive areas, and again, what those would be, those would fall into like the water courses, even residential areas. Again, for some of those other things on that list in the green area that we talked about, even for odors and stuff like that need to be addressed. So for storage types, there's different requirements that it falls under. So when we think about permanent storage structure, that would be required if you're going to be storing manure for longer than 14 days. Temporary field storage, that's usually just between 24 hours and 14 days. Again, the temporary one is more just like, here, it's been delivered and I'm going to be incorporating it very quickly. So with this temporary type of field storage though, you can understand that there's usually a bigger distance from, say, some of these areas because of the risk. You're not going to have walls because, again, usually it's just a mound. And typically it's delivered to in the field where it's going to be applied or very close by. So the big difference here is more of a structurally, you know, how it's housed, so that would be your differences there.
I'm sorry, now, they say anywhere on your farm property, if it's permanent storage, they want to cover it?
If it's permanent storage, sorry.
Well, typically, if you're both conventional farms or organic farms, if you get a source of manure, you'll get it and you'll put it in windrows for a minimum 6 months, often 18 months and longer. And we don't cover them.
No, and I mean, this is what it says, and again, I apologize for, like, when it comes to the nutrient management plan, there's a lot of different requirements. They typically you should be using for a lot longer, or if you're using it for composting, you should be incorporating it as soon as possible. They suggest that if you're going to be storing it for longer than the 14 days, that you should have some sort of permanent structure. Now this might be more so for, if you've been identified to have a nutrient management plan, because that's where it becomes a little bit different. There's some different requirements, but this is a suggestion for, this is a suggestion that they had in the book, like best management practices.
Thank you.
But again, if you know you're going to be storing it for a long period of time, then try and keep it as the most distance that you can have away from any of those sensitive areas. And they do suggest sometimes even putting covers over them. If it's aired during times where there's going to be a chance for increased contact or runoff. So we kind of just touched on that a little bit. If you do have a temporary field storage location, you really want to make sure that it's away from any of those sensitive areas, residential areas, again, because it's not covered. There's not usually a berm or something to divert it if water comes in contact with it. So the more distance that you can have that's going to be practical for you, the better. They do talk about having a slope of less than 3% again, because then if you have a huge slope, it's just going to run off and be gone, and then it's just going to really increase the chance for contaminating the environment. And then the other requirements, like having it directly on bedrock, sandy soils or bedrock, again, because it's really not going to go anywhere, and then it's just going to push it outwards and just cause it to leachate and run off more so than if it could actually be incorporated. So to your question before about the siting distances, this is just a summary list. There are different references. There's a series of best management practices manuals for buffer strips, manure management, nutrient management, a whole bunch of things. And then this is just a summary table for one of those, from one of the best management practices book, and I'll show kind of an example of those at the end. So you can see here, there's different requirements depending on if it's a permanent or temporary field storage. Surface water is the same, but as you go through it, there's some differences. So just to be cognizant of what those are and make sure that you're abiding by some of those requirements. I did ask the question to the nutrient management branch about, what about if you have an edible crop or a fresh fruit and veg crop nearby? And obviously the best practice would be 50 meters, but she said basically the minimum requirement would be the 3. Like that's their absolute sort of minimum for a buffer strip. So 3 meters could be the minimum, but I mean, I would think of that more of a sensitive area, especially if it's a fruit and veg crop. But she said that right now that's not indicated as sort of one of those high risk areas at the moment. So when we're looking at soil amendments and what we need to be doing to sort of make sure that they're not contaminating surrounding areas, if there's a way that you can divert that water, that's the best. So these are obviously a lot more high-tech, high-end, usually seen more when you have livestock or a lot of influx of manure coming onto the property. This particular picture down here is an engineered vegetated filter strip, and that if you do incorporate something like that onto your property, then you do need to have an engineer design that, and you can see here that there's regulations that pertain to that. If alternative methods, because manure is at risk, because you have that raw product, there are alternative methods, and one of those methods is using composted manure. So that's manure that's gone through that treatment process. It sometimes will have less, say, nutrients or nitrogen that you might need, but it's kind of a toss-up because it's a safer product than if you were to use raw manure. Some of the requirements when you're using composted manure will fall under that additional compost quality guidelines, and that's set by the CCME, the same people for the water. So there are some guidelines that you need to follow with that. But you can achieve very good compost manure using a variety of methods. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of a common method that you can use that generally can reduce that pathogen load and is an accepted treatment method for manure. So when we talk about composting manure, these are the things that typically are of concern. You need temperature. You want to make sure that that CN ratio is where it needs to be to achieve that best decomposition and treatment process. It needs to be aerated and it needs to have moisture, and there's different recommendations for each of those. So this is where we get into, just some of the, again, there's so much detail that you can follow, but this is sort of like your target points. So if you are going to be managing your compost pile, your manure and composting it yourself and turning it on a regular basis, you want to make sure that you're aiming for this 55 degrees, lower than the bacteria won't work, higher than you can kill even the good ones that are doing that decomposition process. So this is sort of like your golden rule right here. So you want to have 55 degrees for 3 days and then turning it at an interval of 3 days for 15 days period. So this way, because it's going to be hottest in the center, and then the outside's going to get cooled off. So you want to make sure that you're always sort of flipping it around so that so that all of the parts of that compost mound, that manure mound, are undergoing that treatment process. Ideally for carbon ratio, you want 25 to 1 or 30 to 1, and this can be achieved by adding different types of manures or different types of organic material, and I'll show that on the slide as a reference slide here shortly. And again, you can manage those things, but you just need to be cognizant of what you're using and what you're trying to achieve. So this is just basically a very quick summary, just to show you that depending on what type of organic material you're using, there's quite a difference in carbon to nitrogen ratios. So again, just be cognizant of what you're using and what you might need to add to make sure that you're achieving that 25 to 30 to 1 ratio. So you need air, because bacteria, you need that aeration process to undergo that decomposition and for the bacteria to work properly. So you want to make sure that you are properly managing that oxygen and carbon dioxide, and by turning the pile, that helps do that. So that helps to achieve and maintain the pile. Moisture, you want to make sure that there's a 50 to 60% water by weight. Again, different things can lead to different sort of composition in that manure, but there is like you could get it tested, but there's sort of like a fail-safe squeeze method. If it feels sort of like just like a sponge, like a good sponge, and that's sort of a good measure to follow. If you squeeze it, it's seeping water too much, and if you have too much water, it's going to kind of spoil. It's going to kind of like rot. And then if it's all flaky and dry, then it's too dry, and then you're not going to achieve that proper composting treatment. So just some things to think about. So just a question here. So you have, this is a situation, and can anybody see any issues? So we've got our temporary manure pile here. We've got some vinery, some grapes here, and then we have some wetlands, some cattails. Can anybody find out maybe some possible issues with this scenario? What's that?
You would never put it there.
No, I mean, it was put there by somebody, but no, you should put it there, you're right. I mean, obvious reasons, right? Because, I mean, I don't even know, it looks like it's pretty much sitting on the wetland there. It almost looks Photoshopped, but it's really not. And to be quite honest, if you're going to try and manage this and compost this, I mean, you don't really have any room to even get in there to turn the pile properly. And then, I mean, between wind carrying it to contaminate the product, runoff maybe not as much of a deal here on this side, but more so on that side. But yes, of course, there's a lot of different things that can go here. Ideally, this is not what you would be doing, but just an example that you just got to be cognizant of what's going on. I know there was an incident a couple years ago in Niagara region where a producer is going to be very close to harvesting his peaches. And I believe it was the neighbor, they got sort of a, they were done doing what they needed to be doing, they got a load of chicken manure. And it was right adjacent to the site, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? This is kind of a risk because it's right adjacent to my crop and I need to be harvesting, and what's the risk? So they did end up doing a bit of I can call it like a very light, and I don't know exactly that they used, but it was almost like a sanitizer spray for the crop, and then they harvested it and like covered up the mound, harvested it, and got rid of the fresh product. Not got rid of it, but that was their sort of their corrective measure to deal with it before there was any rains or excessive winds that could have directly contaminated that crop. So again, it might not always be what you're doing, but it could be what somebody else might be doing. So just things to be thinking about. But they they identified that there was a risk. They made some calls, and then they put in some corrective actions to try and to make sure that they reduce the risk to the product. So compost teas is another alternative method to using raw manure. Like I said before, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty when it comes to the use and management of compost teas. It is a liquid process. It's a process by leaching all those nutrients out of that product to get this tea slurry type product. And as I mentioned before, just like with the other ones, you need a certain level of bacterial content to make that process happen. But because with compost teas that you use a lot of additives in that, those additives, just because they're great for the good bacteria, if your starting material had a lot of pathogens in it to begin with, you're going to be encouraging them to grow as well. So it's really good to be able to, if you are using sort of a manure base to start off with, that you get it tested to ensure that the pathogen level is at a minimal or at a what they would consider a safe level. So when we talk about a fully mature compost, that's what we're talking about. So one that's gone through that complete treatment process so that the pathogens are at a level that is going to be safe to use. Where possible, if you can limit those additives, the better. Yes, they are required for this process and for this process to be effective, but if you can limit them to as much as you can, and then that's not going to encourage any additional growth. Just like with any other process, you need aeration and you need all these processes to make it happen. But with compost teas, they're not much different when you're using the other types of soil amendments, but you really do need to apply these immediately after the steeping process, just because you have a lot more liquid there. So there is that possibility of bacteria pathogens growing much more quickly in this type of product than if you had it in sort of a composted manure or regular manure. And where possible, don't apply it to the edible portion of the crop. So some things to think about before applying anything really. You really should know what your crop has or what it needs before you start applying, whether it be an agricultural chemical, whether it be applying calcium, whether it be applying lime to your soil, or a manure. It's really important that you do sample whatever it is that you're applying it to make sure that it even needs it. And I realize most producers do that. They don't want to just spend money just because they want to, because they don't want to. But it is good to know that, are you doing what your soil needs? And if your soil needs it, then you can go put the proper processes in place to apply that appropriately. So just like in the cleaning and sanitizing of our facility, when we're using equipment and tools, or if it's harvest tools or harvest bins, for anything, you want to make sure they're cleaned and sanitized as much as possible where required. And then with different types of equipment, especially when we're talking about spreading equipment, you want to make sure that it's calibrated. Often, you'll see when someone's applying manure, they'll go out, and by the time they get to the end, there's either none left because it all got dumped in the beginning. And that can happen because things can get clogged and jammed up really quickly, but just make sure that things are calibrated. And again, I know producers do that. Again, you want to make sure that you're doing the best thing for your operation and the intended purpose, but it is a situation that I'd say this one or proper maintenance maybe falls by the wayside, especially when we're really busy in the season. And we think, well, I already calibrated it, should be fine, but especially with manures and that, where things can get a little bit gunned up a lot more quickly. So, and also just make sure that the equipment that you're using is appropriate for what you want to be using it for and for the product that you're using. So just because you've used it to spread something, it's not necessarily conducive to use it just for a different type of product. In this particular situation, you want to make sure that you aren't applying it to the snow or in frozen snow. Frozen, I can't speak today, I apologize. Frozen soil or on top of snow. There are some allowances, I guess, it could be 2 centimeters of snow or whatnot, but the best practice is to not do it at all, because you really are increasing that risk of runoff, and really it's very difficult to incorporate into the soil at that point. So there is a time from December 1st to March 31st that you really shouldn't be applying any manures to the land. So typically, post-harvest is the best time, prior to when the snow and the freezing temperatures happen. There's different things that can also affect, how you're applying and how those soil amendments are getting used by the soil, what type you're using, how you're applying it, and of course, what we just talked about, the timing of application. For all of these, you want to make sure that you're incorporating that product as soon as possible into the intended target, like the soil. Within 24 hours is the best practice. When we're talking about manure, if you're applying raw manure to your soil, you need to wait that 120 days before your days to harvest. And the other one, if you're getting compost from, say, if you're outsourcing it, it's really good to get some sort of letter of assurance or verification that it has gone through that proper treatment process. Again, because if there's a high level of pathogen content, then now you're putting your crop and your operation at risk. And with compost, you don't necessarily have to wait that 120 days. So if it hasn't been treated or composted properly, then you're just really adding the risk factor to your product. And where compost teas are concerned, it really is important to use it immediately after. But keep in mind that some people do use it as a foliar nutrient. So again, if you are using it that way, try to do it when it's not necessarily when the edible portion of the crop is there. Of course, you want to avoid these things, and these you would do anytime. You don't want to be spreading any type of agricultural chemical or soil amendment, during rain, high winds, or on snow. That's just a fact. You don't want to be doing that. Where you might have sensitive areas, and we talked about this a little bit in the water presentation, but if you do have sensitive areas that you know about, maybe start to incorporate that vegetated area to help protect. As we saw on the slide, that information, it said, if you have a 5 to 10 meter vegetated strip around some sensitive areas, you can reduce up to 90% of any of that leachate getting into that sensitive area. So for what it might cost to plant a vegetated area to keep that protected, that'd be great, and then you're doing like a double bang for your buck. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're following all those pre-harvest intervals. It's also really good, now this is a little bit more applicable if you have a lot of manure in your farm, you might have livestock, or even those big sort of storage areas, or even digesters for manure or liquid manure. But it is really important to post signs, again, whether it be for hand washing or for something else, because it's creating that awareness about the processes that you're doing and the dangers that might be there. And with certain manure storage facilities or sites, or those digesters, whatever it might be, there is a huge risk, or there could be a risk of people getting harmed, and you don't want that to happen at your premises. So when it comes to training workers or record keeping, if your farm is identified as requiring a nutrient management plan, those that are applying soil amendments need to have a valid applicator's license for that process. Again, you want to make sure that they're instructed and trained thoroughly, because that's a very sort of specific task, and you want to make sure that they're doing it properly for a lot of different reasons, but just to make sure that they're following the proper procedures. And then also, they might not realize that, if they're applying it in rain or applying it close to a water course, that the risks of contaminating those water sources. So again, it's about including that awareness and so when people are aware of what the risks are, then they can put practices in place and do things a little differently.
There's a question over here.
I'm sorry.
You said, so can you say the first part again on the last one? So
Yeah.
everyone that applies, it needs to have a license?
So, and I got some clarification for this because this, under the nutrient, there's so many details, but under the Nutrient Management Act, there's certain premises, and it's usually related to those that might have livestock or the larger manure storage. If they are identified as needing a nutrient management plan, then on that particular premise or operation, the people that will be applying or using the soil amendments need to have a specific nutrient applicator's license.
And where do you look at? Are you going on a website to?
I think that one would be MOE. I can look into where that would, where they would get that. In the environmental management branch, you would probably have that information. I can look that up for you. If you put that on that little sheet, I can look into that for you. It'd be one of those two areas that we would probably be able to help you with, where you get it to training.
Excuse me, is there a list of what those amendments are?
Sorry?
Is there a list of the amendments of what constitutes a soil amendment?
At the beginning of the presentation.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. There's lots of different things that fall into soil amendments, not just, manures and organic material. But for what we're talking about today, it's raw and untreated manure, composted manure. So we're basically it's composted manure, and then compost teas.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
That's all right. So, again, what might seem like common sense, but something that can very easily happen. Again, if you have someone that might be, operating your tractor or applying, different things, just make sure that they're aware that, you might have some biosecurity issues, or you might have some sensitive areas that you might just need to put in some different practices, like washing down the tractor or whatever, before you're using it for a different area. And as well, like visual inspections. Maybe there's been some erosion of soil or whatnot, so now there's actually runoff going into a sensitive area where that wasn't happening before. So if you have that open dialogue with your workers and they're aware of, hey, you know what, that's a risk, because now I know there's an issue if there's water going from, my livestock field or from my cropping fields into the water, that's a risk, and I need to identify that. So just so, again, it's having that open dialogue and creating that awareness. Again, procedure template, I'm not going to go through this, we went through this enough yesterday. Templates are good. This is just an example of how, if you were to do your own composting, this is the type of record that you could use. So you would include, your date, your temperatures, how often it was turned, who's doing it, some of those important factors that we talked about. This is just a quick quiz, and then I believe that's going to finish this section up. So, trying to flip through. So we'll just talk about it as a group. So what of this list, which is not a food safety risk when we're using soil amendments? So is it runoff, leaching, odors, or well water contamination when we're talking about food safety? Odor. That's right. Mind you, it is a concern. When we, that table we had at the beginning, that is a huge concern, and they talk about it quite a bit in the best management practices book about being good to your neighbors and having that open dialogue, because there are going to be odors if you're applying manure. But so, if you can kind of work with them, let them know when it's going to happen, maybe at times when they're indoors versus outside playing, something like that, then they do talk about that, because that is usually when they'll get phone calls, the MOE will get calls, is because of an odor or an application going on. But when we're talking about food safety, no, it's not a risk, right? So number 2. Manure management and amendments for compost standards follow Ontario regulations. Is this true or false? Pardon?
Sure.
Yep, I know. Just keep you thinking. So what's the greatest risk when we're using soil amendments? Is it cross-contamination through transferring of clothing or equipment? The fact that it can very easily adhere to fruits and vegetables or other products? Or the contamination of water sources by runoff and leaching?
Oh,
It is true, all of them are a considerable factor, but when we talk about manure specifically, and when at the very beginning, the main focus of when we're using manure is C. I agree, it's kind of a tricky one. All of these are what can cause food safety issues, but when the focus, especially for like a nutrient management operation, it would be C, and that's protecting our water courses and our sensitive areas, because then that relates to further operational activities. Number 4, so what is the minimum separation distance between surface water and manure storage? Remember off that list?
3 meters.
That's from 50.
So there's 45, 50, 15, and 3.
50.
Right. That one was specifically mentioned as far as surface waters. And that's for temporary or permanent. That was one where the numbers were actually the same. And then what is the required time interval from point of application to harvest? Yeah, 120. Good job. And those answers are in your book. And so there's a link again. You can sort of just recopy that or go to e-laws and type in this is the number for the Ontario regulations for more information. There's also a production guidebook there. These are the best management practices that I was talking about. There's a whole series of them. There's probably about 10 or 15 of them on various things. The ones related to this, there's nutrient management, manure management, buffer stripping. Those are free through the ministry. You just have to call and get the beautiful books, actually, great reference materials, but they're free, but you just have to call and order them. And then fact sheets. And there's a lot of those fact sheets, like I said, on those USB sticks. So there's, under the producer side, you'll see on, if you've got both USB sticks, there's a producer folder. Each section, it sort of falls into each section's GAPs. Where there's an applicable fact sheet, you'll find it in there, or there's also another, when you first go onto the USB, there's additional resources, and in there, then you'll find anything else in the fact sheet. So there's quite a lot of material on there for your reference and fact sheets and info sheets. And that's it for the soil one. Are there any questions more specific? Yes, sir.
It wasn't mentioned, what about sludge?
Like human sludge or manure sludge, it's you can't use that. It's illegal to use it.
For vegetable production?
Yeah, you can't use you can't use human sludge.
I think they're spreading, the biosludge, they're spreading it on fields where dairy cattle are. Oh,
I know for like the crops, it's
They're the one where they grow wheat.
I think what they're talking about is treated sludge, like it's been treated and biodegraded, let's say the region of Palm, for example.
okay.
So it's been treated and then it's applied to farmland, but I believe, well, I know, it's not, you can't use it on fruits and vegetables, but you can use it on field crops.
Yeah, corn and manure.
Because that's one of the, even in the Canada Gap, it says that, it's like I think it's like not a double negative, but it says like sewage sludge is not used or something.
Yeah.
You have to check that off.
There are certain wait periods for any sort of like pork crops when you apply sewage sludge, and it is treated, but you can apply paper biosolids on vegetable lands, but there is a long wait period.
It would have to be really long.
It's about a year or two.
I think
sort
it's
of
fine.
wait period. Well, you can do it in vineyards. You can do it, vineyards, they do every second row, and they incorporate every second row for a 5-year period, you can only do so much. But they do that in Niagara a lot with paper fiber biosolids. It adds an incredible
Yeah, that's different though.
It's different, but it's along the same lines as the biosolids. You can't really apply, but you can up in Delhi, like those areas, they have put sludge on fields before, but there's a huge long wait period.
Yeah, and I'll look into that a little bit more.
I think you need to, if you're going to, the person who hauls it, if you're going to be carrying it, I think you need a permit.
Oh, yeah.
It's a completely regulated process by the Ministry of the Environment. So there's soil sampling, there's testing of the product, there's testing of the...
And even of the product too, I would just...
Oh, absolutely. There's significant regulation to that, but it is possible.
Okay, but for Canada Gap, it's not, ever. You can never use it for Canada Gap. even if it's, there's some companies that have